know about the interactions between invasive plants and our very important wild pollinators, with a particular focus on the impacts of Scotch broom on Oak Savannah ecosystems. As we get into the talk, I want to just lay a few ground rules. First of all, I think everyone's muted. And if you just have comments to make, use the chat function of Zoom, which you can find, I think, on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions you want posed to Dr. Gillespie at the conclusion of her lecture, please put those in the Q&A box. Again, you can find that, I believe, on the lower toolbar on your screen. So questions you have for Dr. Gillespie to be given to her at the end of the lecture, please put in the Q&A. Well, with that, with no further ado, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Sandra Gillespie. Sandra?
All right, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and good evening, everyone who is forgoing this unseasonable sunny weather to hear me talk a little bit about some critters that really enjoy the sunshine themselves. So, as you know, or have been told, I'm a professor at UFV, and I study a lot of different things about bees and bees' interactions with their plants. And right now, a lot of what I'm doing is studying the diseases that affect native bumblebees, but I've also worked on wild pollinator health and diversity, and interactions between crop management in agriculture and pollinators. And then, of course, what I'm going to talk about tonight regarding the impacts of invasive plants on pollinator communities. So I was asked to present to you all about invasive plants and native pollinators, and I'm going to kind of address that in two parts, because you can't think about how these invasive plants are affecting pollinators until you think about the things that pollinators need. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about native pollinators, native bees, what they are, and I realize maybe if you've been attending the webinars all month, maybe you know a little bit more than the typical audience already. And I'm going to talk a bit about what these really cool organisms need to survive. And then we'll talk about invasive plants, how they affect the communities that they invade, and how that can lead to impacts on bees. So why bees? When I started doing my research, the question of why bees was not on anybody's mind. And then following colony collapse, suddenly everybody was like, oh gosh, bees. And so I guess I'm going to talk very briefly about what pollinators are, even sort of in the bigger picture, why they're important, the varied lifestyles of wild bees, and what they need, and a little bit about why we're worried about bees and not just the honeybees. So a pollinator is actually kind of a big umbrella term, because it can really be anything that visits a flower, gets some pollen all up on its face, and transfers it to another flower of the same species to fertilize their seeds. So anything that visits a flower can be a pollinator, not just fuzzy bees or sort of charismatic butterflies, but wasps, ants, beetles, mosquitoes, bats, vertebrates, vertebrates can be important, butterflies and bees, of course. And pollinators are important because they provide these things we call ecosystem services. And these are things that a natural ecosystem does that benefit ourselves that would be really difficult to do for ourselves, right? So you couldn't go out and pollinate all of the flowers instead of having the bees do it, right? And those services can be important in both these wild ecosystems and in what we call agroecosystems or agriculture. So 1/3 of the world's crops their yields are increased by pollination. And this number is actually really old now, that bee pollination is valued at 50 billion yearly. And it's not just all about the honeybee. Many of these important crops, things that we care about like coffee or chocolate, are not pollinated by honeybees. They're pollinated by all kinds of interesting other things. So wild bees. I always like to tell people right off the bat, honeybees are not native to North America. I wouldn't call them invasive necessarily, maybe. But when you worry about pollinator conservation, if you focus on honeybees, it's a little bit about like worrying about chickens when you care about endangered birds, right? So honeybees are a sort of an agricultural species. And then we have these hundreds and hundreds of wild bees that are native to North America. And of course, my numbers are from Canada, terribly sorry. But we have 800 some odd species of bees in Canada. I know in the United States, you have many, many more. Places like the desert have amazing bee diversity. And even here in British Columbia, there's 600 different bee species or more. And they're quite different than honeybees, right? They don't build these massive colonies that last for years. A wild bee might have a nest that looks something like this in a twig with just a few different cells with a few different larvae. So really kind of a different lifestyle. And I like to kind of equate it to comparing annual versus perennial plants, with the honeybee being kind of like a perennial plant. It has this colony that builds up over the year and over multiple years that collects resources to survive the winter and can become quite large and live for many, many years. Most native bees are like an annual plant. They come out in the spring, they collect resources, they reproduce, and those individuals that came out that year will die. And the things that survive until the next year are larvae or overwintering adults. But they kind of have this sort of annual life cycle. And I'm a little biased because bumblebees are my thing. So I tend to split bees into two categories, bumblebees and everything else. Sorry. So there's about 50 species of bumblebees in North America. And they are somewhat similar to the honeybee in that there is a queen. She forms a colony, but that colony only lives 1 year. So right about now, especially on a day like today, you might see these big, fat bumblebees flying around on the ground like they're searching for something, and they're looking for a nest site, right? And that queen will go in and establish a nest and rear some workers that will then go out and do all the work of helping her build up her colony so they can make new queens and males at the end of the year. And these bees nest underground in old mouse cavities, mouse burrows, other cavities. I've seen them in people's birdhouses, in their compost heaps, and all kinds of interesting places. And bumblebees are what I would call generalist foragers, meaning they will get food from anything, anything that is a flower, or maybe even a hummingbird feeder if it's the right shape. They're opportunists, right? So they will as happily visit native plants as they will visit the plants in your garden. And then we have this sort of category that I call other bees. Now, if you think there are 800 bees or species of bees in North America, and then there's 50 species of honeybee or bumblebees, then there are there's a lot of diversity in this sort of other bee category. And they do all kinds of things. They nest in a wide variety of habitats. They vary from these solitary bees where the female digs one single nest and lays some eggs and provisions them with pollen, and that's it, to bees that form social aggregations, just like bumblebees. And of course, like bumblebees, they have this annual life cycle. And there's just extraordinary variation in the different species that are in this group. But one thing that all of these different critters have in common is that they need two things. They need a place to live. This is my silly place to live here. And they need food. And I just like this picture of donuts, so that's why that's up there. But because we have all this diversity, what they need will differ between different species. Right, so we have bees that nest in the ground, and different species require different types of soil, bare soil, or they'll nest in your lawn. And there's bees that nest in cavities, like I bet many of you are familiar with the blue orchard bee, Osmia lignaria, that you put out these nest blocks and they will lay their eggs in these lovely little tubes and cover them up with mud. And so Osmia, the blue orchard bee, is an example of what I would call a renter. They can't dig their own holes, but they will rent out whatever sort of correct sized cavity they can find. And then some bees are what we would call excavators, right? So these are bees that can dig their own holes in the soil or can even chew their way through wood to build their own nests. So a habitat has to have a place for them to rear their offspring, right? And then it also has to have food. It's not so simple as just having a bonanza of flowers. They need to have the right quantity of foods, the right quality of foods, and then more importantly, from the perspective of invasive plants, they need what I would call continuity of food, right? So food quantity for a bee is nectar and pollen. That's the carbohydrates and the proteins of the bee world. So the pollen is protein for rearing new bees, right? So if they can't get pollen, they can't rear offspring. And then all that good sugary nectar is what they use for foraging and other activities. And then of course, partly for also rearing new bees. And different plants differ in the quantities of these two different resources that they provide. Some flowers provide both. So what would be flowering right now? Salmonberry. Salmonberry flowers provide both nectar and pollen. Most things in the rubus family are great plants for bees in that they have nectar and pollen both easily accessible. But then some plants only provide one or the other. And here are a couple examples. Blueberry is an agricultural species, and invasive Scotch broom both provide very little nectar, but they do provide pollen as a resource. Unfortunately, there is this quality problem in that not all pollen is created equal. Pollen, much like any protein you might try to eat, varies in protein content and the array of amino acids that are present. So bees can't necessarily just survive on one plant alone. They might need to forage from a variety of plants to meet their nutritional needs, right? So this is just an example, the percent protein of a pollen from 220 plant genera. Some of them are really terrible, like blueberry is a very low protein pollen, and some of them have really high pollen or high protein concentrations. So if you've got nectar and you've got pollen, you also need those things to be available for your whole life. And this is where the whole food desert thing comes in, right? So bees have different species of bees live for different periods of time. A bumblebee colony will get started in the spring and might actually continue all the way through to the fall. Whereas a short-lived spring bee like the blue orchard bee might be done with its life cycle before we even hit summer, right? So you can think about a habitat where a bee is trying to get food to rear its offspring. And you might have, if you think about these little graphs, as the available food. Early in the spring where I live, the blueberry is going to come out and there is lots and lots and lots of food. There's a bonanza of food if you can feed on blueberry. And then you might have other plants throughout the year that hopefully overlap, and you have this sort of continuity of food due to overlapping flowering plants. If one of those plants disappears, you might have a food gap, right? Where it's not really going to affect your short-lived little osmias, but the bumblebee colony might be sitting there in the middle of summer going, well, what am I supposed to eat? Right, so invasive plants are one of those things that can provide a bonanza of food for a very short period of time. But then when that invasive isn't flowering, because it's displaced the rest of the plant community, there's nothing else to eat before and after. Okay. So what challenges are facing bees today? Well, to say that the bees are declining is not exactly true. Some bee populations are actually fairly stable. Others are declining, and what's happening to those different species varies in space and time. So where I live, this bee down here, the yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus vosnesenskyii, they seem to be increasing in abundance, whereas the white-tailed bumblebee has pretty much disappeared from the Fraser Valley. But all of these different critters do face challenges living in human-modified habitats. So just as maybe some of this will be familiar to you, I don't know if you've seen patterns in Washington, but boy, are we seeing a lot of habitat loss. The Fraser Valley is mostly farm, and the bits that aren't farm are condos. And the bits that aren't condos yet are probably going to be condominiums soon. So there's a lot of urbanization and land conversion happening. So the conversion to agriculture happened a long time ago, but right now forests and other marginal areas are being converted into houses because the housing market is bananas. And that's taking away habitat from not just wild bees, but all kinds of things. And then in the habitat that's there, we have this issue of habitat degradation, where what I would call kind of low intensity agriculture pastures with a variety of plants that are actually potentially really good bee habitat are being converted into high intensity agriculture like blueberry farms. And then we have the impacts of invasive plants, where a beautiful diverse habitat like this gets turned into something that looks like that. That's my student right in the middle there in the the field of Scotch broom. So of course, part 2 is going to focus on the second piece on invasive plants and how they can affect bees. Right, so how can invasive plants affect pollinators? I'm going to talk a little bit about Scotch broom and why it's a little bit different from some invasive plants. I'm going to give a little bit of data, some of the impacts that we documented on the Garry Oaks or the Oak Savannah ecosystem up here in British Columbia. And then at the end, I've got some thoughts on what we can do. And then I hope you guys will have some questions and comments and thoughts as well as people that work in conservation and restoration. So I don't need to tell you that invasive plants are a major threat to biodiversity. Kudzu on the right-hand side there is the vine that ate the south, and purple loosestrife is a pretty infamous invasive flowering plant. And they displace diverse native communities and replace them with monocultures of themselves. Now, to be a successful invasive, you have to show up somewhere and be able to reproduce and disperse very rapidly. And so many invasive plants actually reproduce asexually. Invasive grasses, for example, reproduce or wind pollinated, or things that can bud or things like that. But those that require pollinators have to either bring their own pollinators along, so-called invasive partnerships, or they need to show up and be able to co-opt that native pollinator community and say, hey, come visit me. And then that allows the invasive plant to set seed. And bees are perfectly willing to do this because most bees are generalist foragers. And so they'll happily incorporate that native invasive plant into their diet, just like they'll visit the lavender in your garden, or the apple trees or whatnot, or your tomato plants for that matter. But you've got this massive field, in this case of purple loosestrife, and nothing else, right? So these invasive plants are having these dramatic impacts on native plant communities by reducing diversity and displacing those natives. And so via those impacts, they can affect all aspects of a bee's food requirements. So those 3 things I talked about, the quantity, quality, and continuity, depending on the type of invasive plant that's there. So what determines whether a bee can happily visit that invasive plant? Well, many flowers are what we would call generalist. And a generalist is just a plant that has their nectar and pollen out in the open and accessible to everyone. Goldenrod is a great example of a generalist. These are some photos from work I did during my PhD. Goldenrod gets visited by everything: beetles, flies, honeybees, bumblebees, wasps. It's got its resources just right out there, and any kind of insect can go and act as a pollinator. And so maybe you think, okay, it makes sense. Most successful invaders, plants that show up in a new place and become invasive, become this problem, are generalists because they're more likely to be able to get those effective pollinators to visit them in a new habitat. Goldenrod, for example, is invasive in Europe, but there are some exceptions. And you might guess what the exception is. But here's an example that's not Scotch broom. This is Rhododendron ponticum. It's invasive in Europe and parts of New Zealand. And it actually has toxic nectar. So it's got toxic compounds in its nectar. And those compounds are there to act as an antibiotic to prevent the nectar from spoiling, but it's also a filter that deters some bees from feeding. And that means in places where this plant has displaced the native plant community, it's only providing resources to some bees because others can't tolerate those toxic compounds in its nectar. Now, Scotch broom is not toxic, but it is a pain. It's invasive in North America, New Zealand, and Australia, for example. And it has a peculiar floral morphology that favors foraging by large-bodied bees, like this honeybee I've got in this picture here. So Scotch broom, very destructive, invasive in our region, so much so that removing broom from your local park might be a hobby. And this is because it displaces these diverse native communities, modifies the soil in ways that make it difficult to do restoration, and it's very challenging to manage. And it produces lots of flowers. The reason it's here is because it's so pretty. but its floral morphology actually restricts bees to large-bodied bees. So bumblebees and honeybees particularly are able to land on this flower and press down on this keel here. Most of you are plant people, you know what I'm talking about. Press down on this keel here and basically trip the flower open so that the anthers and the stigma, the pollen becomes available so that the bee can get the pollen as a resource. And little bees can't do this, right? So because there's a restriction to a small part of the bee community, you might expect there to be additional impacts of Scotch broom on native pollinators as compared to something like purple loosestrife that really any insect can visit to get some resources. Okay, so I think broom can impact pollinator communities in a few different ways. It can provide food to some bees, but not others. So you might expect in an invaded site, different types of pollinators are going to be present. It might change the types of plants that bees visit for food. Some bees might use broom more, while others might stick with the remaining native plants. And of course, it's displacing the native plants and reducing flower diversity. So there might just be no food for certain types of bees. So we might have fewer types of pollinators present, and the ones that are there might be visiting plants in different patterns than they were before, right? So if we move from a park or a site that looks like the community on the left, which actually doesn't look that diverse, it's just lots of camas, but trust me, this is a very lovely park with lots of flowers, to something that's more like the sort of broom monoculture on the right. What happens? And so we looked at these questions in the Oak Savannah in southern British Columbia, which is also called the Garry Oaks up here, which, as you all likely know, has this wonderful, highly diverse spring ephemeral plant community that is used by an incredibly diverse pollinator community. And invasive species are, of course, a really important consideration in conservation and restoration in this ecosystem. Not just things like Scotch broom, but lots of other stuff. So we were working on Vancouver Island in British Columbia in parks in the city of Victoria and the surrounding area. And we had 18 different sites that varied in broom invasion. Some of them were dominated by broom, like this dreadful picture here, and some of them had next to none. In fact, I think by the time I finished the study, the little broom plant in the foreground had been ripped out because that's what people do in Victoria. So here are a couple questions we can answer. We can look at what types of bees are present and what they're eating. And we can look at broader impacts of broom on the community of pollinators and plants and their interactions. And to get at this, first we wanted to determine the kinds of bees that were there and what kinds of plants they were visiting for food. And to do this, I and mostly my hardworking students went out with nets, and you set a timer and you collect the bees that you see. And you keep track of what plant you collected that bee on. So you have information not just on what plant is there, but also what bee was there and who in terms of plants it was visiting for food. And then we kept some individuals separate and examined their flower use in more detail. And then of course we went out and measured the plant community as well. How many species of flowering plants are there and how abundant are they? Okay, so let's look at the types of bees that were present. Do we see more of the kinds of bees that are more capable of feeding on broom? So these large-bodied bees that can trip those flowers open. And of these species, are some of them more likely to use broom as a resource? So we looked at all the bees we collected and we actually measured their body size. And what we found is that the more invaded a park was, so as we move from dominated by native plants to dominated by broom, bees got bigger. So we collect hundreds of bees and their average size got larger, the more broom was there. And this makes sense, of course, right? If we're collecting on all the flowers at the park and most of the flowers are broom and only big things can visit broom, we're going to see these larger bodied bees that are more able to trip open broom flowers. And that does suggest that broom is limiting the types of pollinators that can use a park. Okay, so of those that are there and using broom, are they also visiting the native plants? And this is I think this is really fun because you can examine this by looking at the type of pollen that the bees are collecting. So we take the little bees and we swab their bodies with gel to get all the pollen off of them. And you stain that pollen with this thing called fuchsin, and the pollen has this three-dimensional structure that stands out quite nicely. And different species of plants, sometimes different genera of plants, have very distinct shapes of pollen. So both species of camas have this D-shaped pollen. Of course, I'm on the wrong screen, D-shaped pollen here. And then Scotch broom has this very distinct triangular structure with these little knobs. So we can count the different types of pollen on the different bodies of these bees and see if it differs with how much broom there is at the site. And so we looked at 4 different species of bee, honeybees, and then 3 common species of bumblebees. And we did this because bumblebees actually pollinate broom in its native range in England. And honeybees are important pollinators in places where it's invasive. So honeybees are an example, and broom are an example of one of these invasive partnerships in Australia. And so we had some bees that we collected on broom, and we had bees that we collected on the native plant camas. And for those on broom, we found that very few of them, well, there weren't very many, for one thing. So broom is there, it doesn't have a lot of nectar, it only has pollen, it's not exactly popular. But the ones that were on it were mostly collecting broom pollen. And this makes some sense. Figuring out how to pry that flower open, get in at those resources takes learning. Bees actually learn, right? So if you're going to use broom as a resource, you should specialize on it and just visit broom. But kind of counter to this, if we look at bees that we collected on native camas, their resource use depended on broom density and the bee in question. So even as broom became the most common plant at the site, some bees, including honeybees, still stuck with only camas. So if we caught them on camas, they were just visiting camas. They weren't kind of visiting 2 things and playing the field a little. The largest bumblebee species, however, began to visit both. So the more common broom was at the site, the more often we would collect Bombus melanopygus on native plants with broom pollen on its body as well, suggesting that it was, rather than specializing on one plant, was taking advantage of both types of resources that were available. And of course, Bombus melanopygus is the largest bodied bumblebee species in our sample. Okay, so larger bees are really important for broom. Broom invasion is filtering the types of bees that can use a park, making large-bodied bees more abundant. And the largest of these, the Bombus melanopygus, were also the most likely to forage on broom, even when we caught them on the native plant. They'd been over on broom collecting pollen before we got there. And I think it's interesting to note that at least in our parks, honeybees just weren't major visitors to broom. They had other things to visit that maybe were more resource abundant. So there's not really any evidence, at least in those parks in our area, that there's a sort of invasive partnership thing going on with people's honeybees. Okay, so what do we see? Yes, broom does change the types of bees that are present and what they are eating. So here's this other sort of trickier sounding question about the larger community. Instead of focusing in on these 4 species, if we zoom out and think about all of the insects that we see on plants, how is broom affecting them? Right, so we know invasive plants reduce the diversity of the native plant community. Right, so the more broom you have at a site, the fewer different plant species you might have. Does this also reduce the number of bee species that are present? We know that bees are bigger, but there might still be many kinds of bees, even if we're seeing more of these large-bodied bumblebees. And then as the community is disrupted by broom, how is that changing the relationship between the insects and the plants? That is, what's happening to the links between the bees and the plants? We know Bombus melanopygus will start to visit more broom, but what is happening to the other bees that are present, and how might that affect the community as a whole? And so this is a question of what's happening in the network of interactions between the bees and the plants. And this is, stay with me here. So the phrase network analysis probably sounds a bit intimidating, but what we're actually doing with these crazy charts is pretty straightforward. We're considering the plants, we're considering the bees, and then we're asking about their interactions. So on one of these things at the bottom, that's the plant community. The wider the bar is, the more abundant that plant was in our sample. At the top, we have the bee community. So the insect community that we collected at this particular site was really diverse. There's lots and lots of bars. These are honeybees here, pretty big bar, but Bombus mixtus was common, Bombus melanopygus was there, and then all kinds of things that were less abundant and more rare. right, and then we have the links between them, and every link says that we caught a honeybee on Camas lachlanii, or we caught a honeybee on Camas Camassia quamish. And the width of the bar says we saw more of that bee on that plant. So these links tell us not just how many bees are there and how many plants are there, but also which bees are using which plants, and what does that pattern look like. And so if we compare the one on the top to the one on the bottom, that's Scotch broom, right? So Scotch broom was not very abundant in the community on the top, and of course was one of the most dominant plants in the one on the bottom. And hopefully just by looking at these, you can see that the community on the bottom is much simpler. There's fewer insect species, there's a lot fewer plant species, and there's some things that are really using broom. In fact, this is Bombus melanopygus right here that takes good advantage of Scotch broom as a resource when it's abundant. So we can take these diagrams and we can measure some pretty straightforward things about them. How many types of plants and how many types of bees are there? And of course, we expect both of these things to decline with broom invasion. Right. And then we can ask how specialized the bees and the plants are. So if you think about something like a honeybee that can, in theory, visit almost any plant to get food, is it doing that at a site that's highly invaded, or is it just visiting the Scotch broom, right? So do bee species visit one type of plant or many types of plants? And as a community is invaded and the number of plants available goes down and the kinds of bees that are present changes, what's going on? And I'm going to show you big crazy graphs for this. I'm just going to kind of give you a bit of a story about what we found. And what we found is that, unsurprisingly, more invaded communities are less diverse in both the plants and the pollinators. So not only do you have bigger bodied bees and fewer of the little ones, there are also fewer kinds of bees. And overall, the pollinator community was smaller. So we just didn't collect as many bees at these broom invaded sites, which makes a lot of sense when you think about Scotch broom's floral morphology and how it restricts its visitors. And then lastly, the bees that remained at those highly invaded sites were less specialized, meaning that the ones that stuck around when broom was dominating would visit many different plant species rather than one or two. So some of these impacts are really intuitive. There's my animations being wonky. So broom displaces native plants and reduces resources for native pollinators. And so unsurprisingly, it's reducing the diversity and the abundance of those native bees. But why might broom reduce specialization or increase the generalization of the bees that are left? Well, honeybees and bumblebees are more likely to forage on broom. And these are all social pollinators that are generalists. They'll get food from any flower they can. So what broom is doing is it's filtering the bee community and excluding these less common specialists that might rely on something like camas or lomatium for food. Okay, so some answers. Yes, larger bees are more common at invaded sites, but those bees are making use of both native and Scotch broom plants. And native bumblebees are actually the major visitors to broom in our region. And this suggests that broom has very handily co-opted or adopted native pollinators, these bumblebees, as its pollinator. And of course, broom is affecting the structure of the entire pollination network. It has these massive impacts on the plant community that then affect the pollinator community, reducing the diversity and abundance of insects visiting those flowers. And by changing the types of foragers that are present, it's reducing the abundance of these less common, more specialized bees. All of the things that were in that other bee category I talked about at the beginning don't do very well at highly invaded sites. Right, so Scotch broom is an example of an invasive plant that isn't just displacing the native plants. It's having these additional effects on the insect community by changing the types of pollinators present and reducing diversity. And this is likely due to its restricted flowers. And I will add that we can test whether these communities are vulnerable to further species loss. And the more abundant broom is, the more susceptible those communities are to losing additional species as you lose more plant species. which suggests to me that care should be taken when you're doing restoration. When you pull the broom out, you need to try and maintain the remaining native plants. And that gets me to the question of what can you do? Well, invasive removal and restoration can definitely restore plant diversity. And in the process, if you restore the plants, you typically restore the pollinators. So for example, around Victoria, this hobby called broom bashing well, I don't know what people are doing right now. Probably they're still broom bashing. People get together in groups and go to parks with permission and work to remove the Scotch broom. And this has really played a huge role in restoring Oak Savannah diversity in the Victoria area. But when you remove an invasive, you need to consider what's going to replace it. These Oak Savannah habitats have a bit of an advantage, I think, in that they have a bit of a seed bank. The native plants are kind of hanging around in the fringes. And as many of these places, as you remove the broom, you see things like camas come back in large numbers. But remember these charts, right? So if you go into a habitat and you remove all the broom, now there's no food, right? And something like Scotch broom isn't feeding that many bees to begin with, but you've gone from abundant flowers, at least for part of the year, to nothing. And honestly, I think this is even more important for things like Himalayan blackberry that are generalist invasive species that are visited by lots and lots of bees when they flower. Right, so the ideal thing that happens during restoration is you remove that invasive, and over time you reestablish a native plant community that looks a lot more like this, where you have a totally not accurate to timing sequence of plants from early in the season into late in the summer and even the early fall that provide this continuity of resources that pollinators can use. So it's something to consider when you're doing restoration is what's going to come back. And this is something I think people doing restoration definitely wrestle with, is sometimes you remove an invasive and it's replaced by another invasive, right? So yeah, well, that's a whole other thorn in trouble, isn't it? So considering bees in restoration, think about what's going to come back. When you're doing removal, maybe don't do the entire habitat at once, do it piecemeal so that some of that invasive plant remains to act as a resource to the insects that have come to rely on it. And of course, the other thing I tell people they can do is plant a garden, because who doesn't want a garden? Gardens provide resources, important resources to pollinators. There's a whole host of research on urban pollinator populations. And of course, a nice garden has flowers throughout the year. And if you're planting flowers, plants that flower throughout the year, you're feeding the bees throughout the year, right? I'm not going to tell you only to plant native plants in your garden, because most bees are generalist, and an easy to grow non-invasive cultivar, I'm looking at you, butterfly bush, an easy to grow non-invasive cultivar that has lots of resources might be just as good as struggling to grow a native plant that can't survive in your backyard. Okay, so just to wrap up, we talked a bit about why bees, why do we care about bees? Why are they important? They're important to agriculture. They're incredibly important to wild plant communities, and they're really cool. One of my mentors talks an awful lot about how cute they are. So there is that to consider. I mean, they're pretty fuzzy. That's important to consider. And of course, they're incredibly diverse. You know, you can think beyond the sort of base honeybee to all of these hundreds and hundreds of species of bees that we have in North America. And bees care about nesting habitat, and they care about the quality and continuity of food that they can get. And this, of course, is directly affected by invasive plants, right? Flowering invasive plants can definitely provide food for native bees, and they can have these really weird interactions with native bees where they can increase their population sizes. But because they're also impacting the quality and continuity of food via their impacts on that native plant community, probably not a good thing in the long run. And Scotch broom is unusual as an invasive plant in that it has these restrictive flowers that can only really be effectively foraged on by these large bees. And because of this, we can see that it has additional negative impacts on the pollinator community. And then of course, I encourage you all to think about bees when you are working to restore native plant communities or you're planting their garden. Okay, and with that, I'll thank you all for listening. I didn't talk too fast for myself, and I am super happy to take any questions or talk about restoration with you all.
Okay, one question we have. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. You had mentioned that Scotch broom modifies the soils in ways that make restoration difficult.
Yeah.
I believe it raises nitrogen levels. Are there other things it does as well?
That's the main thing that I know about is the nitrogen fixing, which then can, if I'm recalling the research correctly, and I might not be, so someone in chat can always call me out, can actually make the soils in these spring ephemeral communities more amenable to other invasives. So changing the soils in ways that now it is not an ideal location for what the original plant community was.
Okay. Are there other questions? Please put them in the Q&A if you do. I cannot see, all I can see is Sandra and myself and Denise's dogwood diagram there. So if you're raising your hand, I can't see it. Okay, here's another one. How can I find out which plants are good for nectar and which for pollen?
That's a great question. The Xerces Society has a pretty good plant list for planting for pollinators. And then I don't know, I would just look at the flower. That's just me. So yeah, Xerces Society probably is a really good one to look at. And plants that lots of bees can visit typically have sort of flat open flowers, like you can think of like a blackberry flower. They're very open. You can see the anthers out there with the pollen right where you can see them. And those are the sorts of things that lots of different bees can visit.
Okay.
But for the pollen quality, we actually don't know. It's really hard to measure. So we have a little bit of data on which plants have delicious protein rich pollen, but not a lot because it's really hard research to do.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Next question, how far north do bees migrate?
Oh, there are bumblebees that live in the Arctic tundra.
Oh.
So there's the plant there, the bee community kind of turns over as you move northwards. So we might have some slightly different bees up here than you would have down in Washington even. And as you move north, the community becomes less diverse, but you wind up with these cold weather specialists. And some of those northern specialists you might also see if you hike up into the alpine because they're also alpine specialist bees.
Okay, good, thank you. Next question, if you're going to remove Scotch broom, which will cause a decline in available pollen until you get another species established? What do you recommend as a % of non-native plants to remove per year?
Oh, that's a tough question. I would have to get a big fat grant from the government to study that. So let's do that. I guess what I would say is to think about the fact that bees are what I would call central place foragers. And I didn't have time to talk about this as well, but they have a nest and they will leave that nest for a certain distance to get food. And a big bee like a bumblebee will go more than a kilometer. Mm-hmm. But a little bee like all those little specialists might go 400, 500 meters. Mm-hmm. Right. So you have some wiggle room where the bees that are around can go forage, on the other side of your park or across the fence in the farmer's field to get food, where, you might be able to take out quite a lot, but still have food present for the bees. Yeah.
Okay. Next question, when you collect bees and remove the pollen on them, are you able to release them unharmed? If not, are you concerned about the impact collecting has on native bee populations?
That's a great question. So 400 species of bees, we actually have to collect them and kill them to identify them because you have to put them under a microscope. Sometimes you're looking at the bumps on their jaw to figure out what species there are. So what we try to do is when we do collect bees to put into a collection, I try to maximize the data you get per bee, right? So those bumblebees that we collected and swabbed for pollen were also part of another study. And because we're netting them, we know their links with the plants. And studies generally show that a research project like this actually has a very small impact on the pollinator community because we're only collecting on single days, spread out across weeks throughout the year. So we do our best to have a minimal impact, and then we keep those insects as specimens as data that we can use for other research in the future. So we kind of maximize what we get out of the bees that we do kill.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Here's another one. Several citizen scientists have observed that Bombus occidentalis can be very common on non-native thistles and knapweeds in areas where Bombus occidentalis is otherwise rare. Any insights?
Yeah, when we see Bombus occidentalis in Victoria, it's not in these parks, it's in people's yards. So it's maybe not showing up in the places we would expect. And that's a really interesting observation, that it's using these invasive thistles. As far as insights, I would need to know more, but I do know that a colleague of mine is studying bumblebees up north, like up north. And she's found tons of occidentalis in these northern British Columbia valleys. So they're hanging around in places, maybe not exactly where we're looking, because we didn't see them in Victoria until a student of my colleague Elizabeth started studying bee communities in people's gardens. I haven't seen it in the Fraser Valley yet. And I do some garden monitoring as well as parks, but yeah.
Okay, good.
But I mean, that's a really great example where an invasive plant might sort of be important in some weird ways to some organisms we care about conserving. So it's, you know, to see what all the links are when you're studying things.
Right, good. Here's an observation. Our honeybees love the Himalayan blackberry flowers, which we control as a hedge for the hive, but plant pollinating flowers for all seasons around them.
That sounds lovely. You know, Himalayan blackberry is really hard to get rid of. And you've got a wonderful community for everything that's there. I don't think anyone's getting rid of Himalayan blackberry anytime soon unless something very strange happens, but yeah.
Okay. Here's another comment on Bombus occidentalis. We've found lots of occidentalis over a large range in northeastern Washington, but not in large patches of flowers, only rather small ones.
So that's another good point, like that my tendency as a biologist would be to go study places like in the photo here, where there's lots of flowers and probably lots of diversity. And then if you're not looking in some of these odd places, which it sounds like some of you are, which is fantastic, you might not see them at all. The only place I've seen occidentalis in British Columbia was at the ferry terminal on roses growing by the ferry terminal.
Yeah. Okay.
I haven't convinced them to let me go look.
Here's another comment or suggestion. How about a chart showing the best replacement species for each invasive?
Ooh,
and
that's, I mean, I could give a little insight on that just from observations of the restoration that people are doing here and in Vancouver. So Elizabeth Ellie did some work on some restoration that's been done in Vancouver around the parks there. And for things like both Himalayan blackberry and Scotch broom, it's partly about bringing back the shrubs. Not so much if you're in the Garry Oaks and you're trying to restore these meadows in this sort of very unique community, but along the edges of rivers where we have blackberry, things like thimbleberry, salmonberry. I'm going to have a total blank here because my plant brain is going to shut down on me, but I'm sure you can think of some other things that when you're in the understory of a uninvaded forest, you have all of these different shrubs that are flowering at different times, and trees. People kind of forget about the trees. We saw lots of bees in arbutus. We couldn't get them, but they're up there. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Do you recommend using red elderberry and Himalayan blackberry for making bee nests?
For like making twig nests for bees?
I think that's what they're referring to.
I think you could try just about anything, like dead blackberry twigs. Some bees might like them. There's lots of advice online. Again, I would suggest the Xerces Society is a really good resource for information on bees. They have more information for the United States, but wait, doesn't matter. That's good for you guys. And they do have state by state information. But if you're thinking about nesting habitat, yeah, twigs, bundles of twigs with holes of different sizes. You can make nest blocks that are very particular to the blue orchard bee, which is actually not native to here. It's from Colorado, I believe. It's fine. For whatever reason, that one doesn't worry me. But different sized holes will be used by different sized bees, right? So a diversity of things, and then I would just look and see what happens, which maybe for me, that's part of the fun, right?
Well, I think that's being a good scientist observation.
And a good naturalist, right? Just
Yes,
see what happens, try some things.
Next question, when is the best time for our region to put out bee nest blocks or tunnels made from hollow or pithy stems?
So at least up here, the blue orchard bees are emerging now and starting to nest. So if you're hoping to get some of those guys established, you want to get those out, I think, pretty quick. Everything else kind of, there's different species that are going to come out at different times of year. So if you put things out early and just wait and see, you'll catch those early species and maybe get some of the later ones as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Let's see, here's a comment. The book Real Gardeners Grow Natives has replacements for non-natives and invasives. I think that's an answer to a previous question I brought up.
That's that's a great suggestion. I did grumble about butterfly bush because it's invasive up here. I don't know if it's a problem for you.
Yes, it's on our noxious weed list.
And I remember my parents planting it in their garden, and of course they ripped it out because they're naturalists themselves, but it's so tricky. I think if you have the fortitude to grow all native plants in your garden, then you should go for it. I'm too lazy. I don't have very much sun, and I like flowers.
Another question here. This is a really big picture question.
Yeah.
How do you rate the biggest threats to bees, such as climate change versus pesticides versus habitat loss?
Yeah, well, you could have some arguments about that. I would still put habitat loss right now at the top because it interacts with everything else. So as climate changes, bees like bumblebees might try to expand their ranges northwards, but if there's no habitat there, they can't expand. You wind up in this sort of climate vice where the temperatures are increasing and you're squished from the bottom. So large amounts of habitat and good quality habitat will buffer populations against these other stressors. So that would still be my number one. Climate change and pesticides are both tricky. If you have the habitat outside of farm ecosystems, then the pesticides become less of an issue, right? Because nobody is spraying pesticides in these Gary Oaks on the parks. But in places like where I live in the Fraser Valley, where there isn't a lot of natural land, and the bees that are here are really using these agricultural systems for food, it's definitely something that we have to consider.
Okay, good. And I think your comment about habitat loss is in line with, I believe it was the UN report, about a year and a half ago on biodiversity, and they rated habitat loss, I believe, at the top.
Well, and it's just one of those things that affects everything else, right? So tiny populations are precipitous, and you have one drought year and you have a tiny population and it's gone. Large populations or populations that are spread across the landscape, they're buffered against those changes and sort of the greater extremes that we're starting to see.
Sure. Next question, will adding honeybee hives to your property be harmful to native bees?
Yes. Sorry. So the honeybees do compete with native bees for food. And honeybees are really effective, really good. They're really good at what they do. So they will find the best food in the habitat. They will tell all their friends and they will exploit it to death. If you have lots of flowers and lots of resources and some different kinds of things present, then that's probably okay. But they're not having no effect, I guess is what I'm going to say. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I'm not saying don't have honeybees, because honey is delicious and I like it. And honeybees are actually extremely important for agriculture. So I'm not like anti-honeybee, but if you put them out in parks or if you put them out in places where they're interacting with wild bees a lot, they are interacting and they are competing for the same food.
Okay. And I think this may be our last question. When is the best bee-friendly time to cut back hollow stems in the garden? I don't want to destroy bee larvae or eggs by cutting back too soon.
Ooh, so gosh, that's a tricky question. We don't know a lot about the life cycles of a lot of these little bees and what they might be doing if they're an early spring bee and you've got the stems out in the earth. Well, actually, do you know what I would do is if you got in the habit of cutting them down before spring, then you won't ever have bees in the stems. Mm-hmm. So, because some of them will come out in the early spring and they might lay their eggs. And then those eggs will grow up into little larvae that will then hang out for the rest of the year to come out the next spring. So there could be by May, there could be some little bee larvae in some of those stems. But if you trim them down on a regular basis before you come into spring, then there won't be anything for them to nest in, or you can maybe set up a little spot where you know that they'll be or something like that. But it's a little bit tricky to avoid, but you can also just watch, because they'll come back multiple times to the same stem if they're using it, and you might be able to see that they're there.
Okay, back to observation.
Yeah, no, maybe this is a little bit of a theme. So I try to get my students to start observing things a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You'd be amazed what you see, right?
Yes. Well, okay, here's one comment. Could hollow stems containing overwintering bees or larvae, ? Could hollow stems contain overwintering bees or larvae?
They totally could, yeah. Okay. But you could just stack them in a corner until the spring and then they just come out. So, okay. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's all of our questions. Thank you very much, Sandra. This is a fascinating talk and topic. And yeah, we really appreciate you taking time to out of your teaching and research schedule to be with us this evening.
Well, thank you all so much for the really wonderful questions and comments. And I'm kind of curious about what is going on with occidentalis and thistles now. So I'll make myself a note and maybe we'll follow up on that.
Good, good. Okay. Well, and again, to all of you, thank you for being with us tonight. And please consider joining other presentations that we're having throughout Native Plant Appreciation Month. Again, tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, we have a virtual field trip of the Lacamas Prairie Reserve down in Clark County, north of near Vancouver, Washington. So with that, I think we'll bring it to an end. So again, good evening and thank you again.
Thank you.